Booksy, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing the popcorn tag. I've taken 5 books from books that I read last year. It occurred to me that I never did a favorites video of 2018. So I'm going to use this as an opportunity to read you the opening paragraph of 5 of my favorite reads of 2018. And this is my version of the popcorn tag. I was tagged by Sean, who was tagged by Bookish, who got the tag from Adrian over at Strip Covered Lit. And I've been wanting to do this tag for a while, but you know, I don't often read from my shelves. I shouldn't say that. A lot of the books that I read don't come from my shelves. And so even though I have books that are favorite books, sometimes I don't own them. So in looking back at my list of 5-star reads from last year, some of them are books that I own, and some of them are books that I own, but they're in storage. So I'm not going to be able to do those opening paragraphs. So I looked back at some of the books that I own, and I said, of those books, which are some of the books that I really enjoyed from last year? And I chose 5, and I'm going to read the opening paragraphs of these 5 books as my version of the popcorn opening tag. Thank you, Sean, for tagging me. It's been about 2 weeks. And I'm finally getting around to it. This is a book that was recommended to me by one of you guys. One of my subscribers recommended me to read this book. It sat on my shelves for a while before I finally opened it up, but am I glad that I did. Here are the first 2 paragraphs of this opening chapter, which is entitled Whosoever Sows Desire. That's the title of the chapter, not the book. I'm reading 2 paragraphs because the first one is pretty short. It says, Marx has completely changed the way I view the world, declared the Pallieri's boy this morning, although ordinarily he says nary a word to me. Antoine Pallieri's, prosperous heir to an old industrial dynasty, is the son of one of my 8 employers. There he stood, the most recent eructation of the ruling corporate elite, a class that reproduces itself solely by means of virtuous and proper hiccups. Beaming at his discovery, sharing it with me without thinking or ever dreaming for a moment that I might actually understand what he was referring to. How could the laboring classes understand Marx? Reading Marx is an arduous task. His style is lofty, the prose is subtle, and the thesis complex. And that is when I very nearly, foolishly, gave myself away. That's the opening paragraph of The Elegance of the Hedgehog by Muriel Barbary. This book was recommended to me by Lillian Nicewender. She told me about this book for several months before I finally picked it up, and I recommend it. I gave it 5 stars last year, and it's one that I think I'm going to be rereading this year just because it's one of those books that if you need to become an emotional wreck, read this book. If you feel like you're disconnected with things, if you want to read something that is very bookish and is going to pull you back into the joy of reading just for the purposes of reading. Not that I ever get tired of having a bookish conversation, but sometimes when you push yourself to read a lot, you kind of want to sink into something that is like a well-worn chair, something that you know you're going to read and become completely engrossed in and really enjoy every experience of every emotion that the book is going to provide. This is the book that you could turn to. The Elegance of the Hedgehog by Muriel Barbary. This is translated from the French. The translator is, I think, Alison Anderson. Yes. She also translates for Emily Nothomb. I recommend Alison Anderson's translation. I don't know how much she puts into the translating, but I love her work and, of course, Muriel Barbary's work. This one is also a translated work, and if you've read it, you'll probably recognize it right away. And even if you haven't read it, but if you're very intuitive, you might get the title. Yeah. First paragraph. These chapters are not titled, so here we go. We were going out to dinner. I won't say which restaurant because next time it might be full of people who've come to see whether we're there. Serge made the reservation. He's always the one who arranges it, the reservation. This particular restaurant is one where you have to call 3 months in advance, or 6 or 8. Don't ask me. Personally, I'd never want to know 3 months in advance where I'm going to eat on any given evening, but apparently some people don't mind. A few centuries from now, when historians want to know what kind of crazies people were at the start of the 21st century, all they'll have to do is look at the computer files of the so-called top restaurants. That information is kept on file. I happen to know that. If Mr. L was prepared to wait 3 months for a window seat last time, then this time he'll wait for 5 months for a table beside the men's room. That's what restaurants call customer relations management. That's the first paragraph of The Dinner by Herman Koch. I read this one last year. This book is intense. The characters are probably the most unlikable characters you'll ever meet, and yet the slow reveal of the character study and the intricacies behind this plot are so well worth. And again, this one's translated fiction, is translated from the Dutch by Sam Garrett, and I don't know how much of the work comes from the translator and how much is from the original language, but man, this combination, it was a mouth-watering, intense, appetizing, delicious experience of a meal that was also a character study, that was also literature, that was also political and relationship and social and political exploration, and everything tied up in different parcels that are put together to create a meal that you might just be allergic to, but I wasn't. The next one was one of my big accomplishments last year because it was a huge long book, and so I'll read you the opening paragraph, which is not that long. The opening chapter has a title. It is called Mercury in Sagittarius. The 12 men congregated in the smoking room of the Crown Hotel gave the impression of a party accidentally met. From the variety of their comportment and dress, frock coats, tailcoats, Norfolk jackets with buttons of horn, yellow moleskin, cambric, and twill, they might have been 12 strangers on a railway car, each bound for a separate quarter of a city that possessed fog and tides enough to divide them. Indeed, the studied isolation of each man as he pored over his paper or leaned forward to tap his ashes into the grate or placed the splay of his hand upon the bias to take his shot at the billiards conspired to form the very type of bodily silence that occurs late in the evening on a public railway, deadened here not by the slur and clunk of the coaches, but by the fat clatter of the rain. That paragraph, I don't know if you can tell from the paragraph, but it's meant to lull you into a scene and give you a little bit of background information. But in that opening paragraph, we know nothing about the men themselves. We know that there are 12 men, there are 13 men. Well, there are 12 men and another person because there's a narrator, there's an observer. And the idea that you're introduced to 13 people who at this point are equal in importance suggests that you're in for a really long introduction, which this book needed to have. This is The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. This won the Man Booker Prize. I think, was it the longest Man Booker winner at the time? Wolf Hall is pretty long, but I don't think it's quite as long as this one. This is over 800 pages, and it is an intense character study. It's historical, but it's also present, and so it's relevant to lots of different ages, lots of different times, and how lives and origins and futures are based on the different changes in the world, the different changes in the atmosphere. And there's so much in this book that I'm looking forward to rereading it this year as part of my Man Booker Challenge. But it was one that I read slowly last year as well because this is going to be my third time reading this book. I read this first in 2017. I reread it in 2018. And I'm reading it again in 2019. I think this is a book that I could read every year and probably get something new from. And if you haven't read it before, I recommend it. I recommend that you blot out some time from everything else and just read and focus on this one book, that you're not reading multiple things at the same time, because this is going to require your interest. When I was reading this, I had notes, even though those connections were dynamic, because this is not just circular theory, this is spherical theory. I love a lot of things about this book, and I hope you will too, which is why I'm recommending it to you to try it. But give yourself the time to really get immersed in it and read all 800 pages before you decide whether you love it or not. Another book that I read last year, close to the end of last year, which I'd had on my shelves for a really long time and finally got around to last year, but that I loved. And these paragraphs are really short, so I'm going to read you a few of them. And again, this chapter is not titled, so it's just chapter 1. East of the Tully Club, after Deshapram Shashmel Road splits in two, there's a small mosque. A turn leads to a quiet enclave, a warren of narrow lanes and modest middle-class homes. Once, within this enclave, there were two ponds, oblong, side by side. Behind them was a lowland spanning a few acres. After the monsoon, the ponds would rise so that the embankment built between them could not be seen. The lowland also filled with rain, 3 or 4 feet deep, the water remaining for a portion of the year. The flooded plain was thick with water hyacinth. The floating weed grew aggressively. Its leaves caused the surface to appear solid, green in contrast to the blue of the sky. Simple huts stood here and there along the periphery. The poor waded in to forage for what was edible. In autumn, egrets arrived, their white feathers darkened by the city's soot, waiting motionless for their prey. That's the first paragraph of The Lowland by Jhumpa Lahiri. And in this book, she talks about boys who are not twins, even though they're raised to have very similar origins. But at some point, let me step back. So you have 2 ponds that are side by side. These are now the physical lowland ponds in the neighborhood, in the backyard. And if enough water gets into these ponds, they will overflow their banks and become one. But if the circumstances are adverse, then both ponds will evaporate pretty much at the same rate, and eventually they will both disappear. And so while we have 2 ponds that have the potential to become one, we also have 2 ponds that have the potential to become none. And I thought that that was such a profound way to open up a story about 2 brothers whose lives at some point seem like they diverge and become separate, but also seem as though they become one when the issues and the adversity around them become so much that their banks flood. There's so much to love about this book. It does veer away from following the boys and starts to follow their environment and follow the people in their lives, the people who help to give them their identity and give them their definition. But the study of brotherhood and the study of relationships in family, as well as the generational curses, Jhumpa Lahiri writes beautiful prose. She does character studies extremely well. And this is a book that I recommend. It's one of my favorite reads from 2018. I did not give it 5 stars because, again, she veers away from some of the things that I loved about especially about the opening and the setup and the plot. But this is a book that I loved. The author, I absolutely adore her writing. So I recommend this book, even if I'm not going to tell you that the book is perfect. It is one that I think is quite deserving of a good immersed read and appreciation of. I don't know if I said that right, but read this book and then tell me what you think about it. And then the last book I'm going to tell you about is the book that confused me the most last year. But it's also the one that I probably spent the most time reading just to try to understand. It was only at the end that some of the beginning started to make sense, because I started to understand the context and the symbols that the author was using these objects to represent. So here we go. This one has a title. The chapter is entitled The Way of the Apple Worm. The ant is carrying a dead fly 3 times its size. The ant can't see the way ahead. It flips the fly around and crawls back. Adina doesn't want to block the ant's path, so she pulls in her elbow. A clump of tar next to her knee glistens as it seethes in the sun. Adina dabs at the tar with her finger, raising a thin thread that stiffens in the air before it snaps. The ant has the head of a pin. The sun can't find any place to burn. The sun stings. The ant loses its way. It crawls but is not alive. The human eye does not consider it an animal. The spike heads of the grasses on the outskirts of town crawl the same way. The fly is alive because it's 3 times the size of the ant, and because it's being carried, the human eye does consider the fly an animal. This is the opening paragraphs of Herta Müller's The Fox Was Ever the Hunter. This book was first published in Germany, was translated to English by Philippa Bohm. The author is Herta Müller, and she's from Romania. And she's also a previous winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I have an ongoing challenge to read books by all of those authors. So I was really interested to pick this up. I think I I think I chose it during Women in Translation Month, and I was doing a buddy read of this one with Sean the Book Maniac, who tagged me here. And I read this book several times at the same time, because every time I read a chapter and I didn't quite understand, like the meaning didn't immediately leap out and seize me, then I would go back and study it. And every time I would make a mark of the imagery that the author was using, and every time she used that image again and gave a little bit more of an explanation of what the image meant, it gave me a little bit more meaning, so I could go back and apply it to something that she described previously. And so, like I said, it wasn't until probably the close to the middle of this book that a lot of the first images started to come together, and I was able to see that this was representing the Ceausescu regime and the fall of Nicolae Ceausescu. Is that the name? I don't know if I'm pronouncing these names correctly, but again, Herta Müller is from Romania. She grew up during the time of the revolution, the fall of the dictator's regime, and this book is describing the end of his regime and what it was like living under the rule of this dictator, living in communism, the lives that people had, the corruption and the backdoor dealings and the black market and all the things that they did in order to survive, and the people who had sold out, what they had to do when the regime was falling and their positions were now in jeopardy. I learned a lot about the history from reading this book, and it forced me to go and learn some things that I wouldn't have probably looked up otherwise. And so this book was very important for that reason. It's not the kind of book that you just read with other things, and I guess maybe the complexity was appealing to me, but I felt like when I understood it, I really liked it. So I'm saying it's a favorite because it required me to do so much to get the book, and I felt like after we'd spent so much quality time together, we had a connection. So I don't know if everyone would like this book. I know everyone will not like this book. I tried to read it to my husband. It was my husband at the time. It was my boyfriend. I was trying to read it to him, and he was like, what is that? Sean and I did a buddy read of this. Sean bailed. So I know at least two men who I tried to experience the reading of this book with who weren't really having it, but I liked it. And so that's why I'm talking about it here, because I can imagine that this book will probably not show up on most people's favorite videos. So I'm including it on mine so it will at least get some play. And so that's it. Those are 5 books from my 2018 favorites. Not completely favorites of the year, but 5 books that I read last year that if you haven't read already, I'd suggest that you try them out. At least try it for yourself. See if you would like it. I know I did. And so I want to share it with you here, just in case I never get around to doing a full 2018 favorites read. Here is my popcorn opening paragraphs tag 2018 favorites reads version. I don't know what I'm gonna call this video, but let's go with that title. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you've read any of these, especially if they're unpopular. If you had a different idea, different opinion from me about these books, I'd love to hear that in the comments. Or if you heard me talk about a book that kind of piqued your interest, something that you probably wouldn't have tried out otherwise, but you said, all right, I'll give it a go based on this video. I'd love to hear that as well. So give me a thumbs up if you like this video. Of course, subscribe for more. I try to post videos every other day, sometimes every day, as my schedule permits. You'll be hearing from me or seeing another video from me very soon, but I'd love if you subscribe. Watch another one of my videos. I have a lot of videos. I've been doing this for a couple of years now, so I have a lot of videos down below that you could check out another one. But even if you don't, thanks for watching this one. Let's talk in the comments, and until next time, happy reading.